Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Curiosities. So, in this last religion or God-related video of our free will project, we will talk about Buddhism and what it has to say on free will.
So, interestingly enough, in Buddhism, it's not a question that's ever come up. I challenge you to find any traditional Buddhist text over the last 2,600 years, the Buddhist teaching, etc., that asks, does man have free will? Or human beings, gender non-specific. I don't think you'll find one. You don't find one. Now, the Buddha did address the question, which is then implicitly. It doesn't quite ask it in that way, but he does ask questions about the choices we make. The notion of intention is very crucial to Buddhism. The range of karma really boils down to intention, right? So that's well known. So are our intentions totally predetermined by prior causes and conditions? That's a way of saying that we have free will, but it's not quite asking that. It's simply, are our intentions completely predetermined by the preceding causal nexus? And so the Buddha did address that. And he said, no, they are not. Karma is not fate, it's not destiny. Our choices are choices, and they're not simply predetermined by prior causes and conditions. So he refuted that. And he said, I strongly encourage you not to believe that all of your choices are simply predetermined by, nowadays we say brain chemistry, environment, language, parenting, and so forth and so on. He said, don't believe it.
Because the Buddha never really discussed free will per se. I mean, he never talked about it as an issue. And the first of those is that the Buddha rejects the notion of a permanent soul. He rejects the notion of an everlasting soul, of a soul that continues from moment to moment. He rejects the notion of a soul that's outside of the causal nexus of causes and effects. He rejects the notion of ultimate control.
So the Buddha rejects the existence of a soul or a non-changing self. Buddha says that the self is an illusion. Ego is an illusion. I think this is the most important and profound thing that we can learn from any religion there is. Self-transcendence. Ego transcendence, the baby in the bathwater of religion. More about that in the future.
I think even 5 or 10 minutes of meditation will tell us that we do not have perfect control over really any aspect of our mind. And of course, the idea of weakness of the will in the West, or the idea that we really can't force ourselves to will things that we might want to will, shows that we don't even have perfect control over our will. So these kinds of arguments in early Buddhism, I think, demonstrate pretty clearly that the Buddha rejected a libertarian free will.
So the Buddha rejected libertarian free will, which is the free will in the general sense, the ability to do otherwise.
But that's not the only view that the Buddha rejected. He also rejected the fatalism of Macaulay Gosala, who was one of his cultural competitors at the time, another philosopher who taught his own views in ancient India. And Macaulay Gosala's view was that we have no power or control at all. It was a kind of fatalism. That is, that since we have no power or control over anything, the universe is set up the way it is, it will go the way it wants to go, there's nothing we can do about anything. The Buddha was also opposed to indeterminism, views that the universe or ourselves or our pleasures and pains arose indeterministically, just randomly, that is, without any lawful basis. Because this view as well, leads to a kind of feeling of futility. He was also opposed to the notion that either our past karma or that some all-powerful God was responsible for everything that happens right now. Again, because that led to a philosophy of non-doing.
So if you didn't know already, Buddhism is an atheistic religion. It rejects the notion of a supernatural God.
For the Buddha, there are two kinds of freedom. The first kind I would call mundane freedom. And this is the freedom I just discussed. This is the freedom that we are talking about when we're talking about moral responsibility, when we're talking about karma for the Buddha. And the Buddha definitely believed that we were morally responsible for our actions. That if we did something wrong, we were morally responsible for that. And if we did something right, again, we were morally responsible. And in either respect, he believed, we would be paid back for it in some sense. And this is something that's true of us simply in virtue of being a sentient being. We don't have to be special to have this kind of freedom of the will. Even animals have it. Any sentient being, for the Buddha, has this kind of moral responsibility. They have free will in this sense. We understand that if somebody, as we say, of their own free will, of sound mind and body, picks up a weapon and goes into a store and robs the store, we want to say that person did it of their own free will. They're responsible for it.
So this is where I would disagree with the Buddha on free will. Now, this video is different in that since Buddhism is atheistic, there's no such thing as foreknowledge to ponder over. So I'll debunk Buddha's type of free will in the upcoming videos. It's called compatibilist free will.
However, the Buddha, I think, also would have been in favor of a second notion of free will. And this is the notion that I was discussing when I said that the Buddha believed that we could free ourselves from bondage. Of course, all of humanity, basically, all the sentient beings for the Buddha, with a very, very few exceptions, are, although they're acting freely in the first sense, in the mundane sense, they're not acting freely in the supramundane sense, we might say. They're not truly free. They're only free in the mundane sense. They're only free in the sense of having moral responsibility. So for the Buddha, then, the supramundane sense of freedom is basically being freed from the 10 fetters, the fetters that bind us to samsara. These are the fetters of greed, hatred, and delusion. They're the fetters of clinging to the self. They're the fetters of conceit, and so on. There's 10 of them. So that, in a nutshell, I think, is the Buddha's view of free will. Is it strictly compatibilist? I think it is compatibilist, a compatibilist view of free will. That is, that free will is compatible with a kind of deterministic picture. So while I do think that compatibilism is probably the best Western picture for early Buddhism, it's not entirely clear, and the Buddha left the issue somewhat indeterminate, somewhat fuzzy around the edges, because I don't think he was interested in the topic at all. I mean, he never discusses the topic per se.
There you have it. So we've covered the 5 topmost populist religions in the world and what they have to say about free will. From the next video, we will cover some important terms related to free will before we jump into the philosophy of free will. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you liked it. Do you agree with the Buddha? Please let me know your thoughts on the video, on Buddhism, on free will in the comments below. And yeah, please subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned and stay curious. I'll see you in a bit.